There is a cemetery in the Bronx, St. Raymond's, where over the course of 10 months, May 1931 to February 1932, numerous interments unique to the times took place. Burials consisting of great floral displays, weeping mothers, wives, sisters, and sweethearts. Brothers and friends vowing revenge. For those being planted were victims of one of New York City's great gang conflicts. The war waged between Bronx beer baron Dutch Schultz and a band of disgruntled and deadly former employees headed by Vincent Coll. It's not entirely accurate to call it the Schultz Coll War. There is a tenet to the conflict that is left out. Coll was actually at war with both Schultz and the Mafia. Namely Joe Rayo, a mobster affiliated with Harlem mob boss Ciro Terranova. Coll hated Rayo for some reason lost to history. By the spring of 1931, Dutch Schultz led one of the most powerful underworld gangs in New York City. Originally from the Bronx, the Dutchman started moving into Harlem in an attempt to monopolize the multi-million-dollar policy racket, what today is called the daily three-digit lottery. Schultz realized that there were numerous independent policy banks operating within Harlem's black community and that these bankers were basically defenseless. He simply planned to move in and make the bankers an offer they couldn't refuse. The war with Coll put those plans on hold. Schultz may have began his move into Harlem in late 1930. Rumor of a Rayo-Schultz alliance was mentioned in the press as early as December 1930. Since Harlem was mob boss Ciro Terranova's locale, Schultz had to deal with him, which would account for his partnering with Rayo. Another Terranova man, Danny Iamascio, worked directly with the Dutchman. Coll and his brother Peter had been carrying guns for the Dutchman since at least 1928. Vincent was arrested late that year with a contingent of other Schultz men. John Jacoporo, Charles Warburg, Joe Pidio, James Batto, arrested as James Russo, Dominic Borelli, Mike Basile, and James Rose. Why and when Coll split with Schultz isn't known for certain. Schultz biographer Paul Sand suggests that the break was due to Coll wanting his own territory and the Dutchman refusing. Warring against Schultz would seem suicidal, but when he left, Coll took numerous guns with him. Namely Edward Popke, aka Fats McCarthy, Mike Basile, Dominic Tuffy Odierno, Patsy Del Greco, Frank Giordano. Rounding out the gang was Coll's brother Peter, Louis Bufano and Arthur Palumbo, plus a smattering of others. Some suggest that Coll broke away as early as 1930, but it appears that he and his followers were with the Dutchman up until the spring of 1931. This is supported by the fact that when Schultz was wounded in a nightclub fight in January of that year, one of the first places he fled to was the apartment of Fats McCarthy, which would indicate that there was no bad blood at that time. Perhaps Coll didn't start the war at all, maybe he was forced into a corner. He may have been alerted to the fact that others wanted him dead when on May 12, underworld figure and possible associate Roy Sloan was gunned down after he exited the Mad Dog Boat Club, a speakeasy that Coll had muscled his way into. It was thought that Sloan, who bore a passing resemblance to Coll, was shot down by mistake, the gunners believing him to be the Irish Gangster. 3 days after Sloan was killed, another Schultz gangster, Dominic Borelli, who was arrested with Coll back in 1928, was found shot to death in his furnished room. He had moved out of his father's place because he knew he was on the spot. One of those picked up for questioning was Mike Basile. Was Borelli a retaliatory hit by Coll? Was he rubbed out as part of Coll's gang? Or was he simply an unrelated underworld murder? Timing would suggest that he may have been a fatality of the war. Coll's first confirmed offensive move took place on May 28. That evening found Joe Rayo parked in his car on 116th Street in Harlem. Two of his men, Frank Big Dick Amato and Louis Slats Bologna, stood by the car chatting with Rayo. As the trio conversed, a sedan pulled up and a gunman leapt out and opened fire on the gangsters. Other gunmen also sprayed bullets from inside the sedan. Amato ducked behind a car, but the gunman ran up and shot him in the head and neck. With a bullet in his back, Bologna staggered across the street and stumbled into a restaurant where he called out for an ambulance before dropping dead. Slightly wounded, Rayo slid out of his car and escaped on foot. Amato and Bologna were given gangland send-offs in St. Raymond's, while the boys planned their vengeance. Retribution was swift. Less than 48 hours later, Peter Coll was driving through Harlem when another car sped up alongside him. As they passed, several shots were fired through Peter's windshield and they all found their mark. Mortally wounded, Peter crashed and died a short time later. He then joined Amato and Bologna in St. Raymond's. The next one to go was Coll's best friend Gennaro Iataroli. Called Chin, Iataroli was gunned down in a Bronx bowling alley by a contingent of mobsters headed by Trigger Mike Coppola approximately 24 hours after Peter Coll bought the farm. Chin was the fourth gangster funeral in St. Raymond's in as many days. Taking 3 days to grieve and regroup, the Mick went on the offensive. Hitting the Dutchman in the wallet, the gang descended on one of Schultz's beer drops and, at gunpoint, made the employees destroy 10 trucks and 150 slot machines. On June 3, gangster Louis DeRosa was found in the Bronx with several extra holes in his body. Depending on which paper you read, he was either a Schultz man or part of the Chin Iataroli gang. It's interesting to note that at the time, the press was aware of a gang conflict but not exactly who was leading the opposition against Schultz. 5 days later, the body of John Jacoporo was found in the back seat of an abandoned Buick 5 bullets heavier. Like Dominic Borelli, he was arrested with Coll back in 1928. Though described as a Schultz man, it can't be said for certain whether or not he was with the Dutchman or Coll. Either way, he ended up in St. Raymond's with the others. Without a territory of their own to produce funds, the Coll gang took to kidnapping underworld figures. One of their targets was nightclub owner George Big Frenchy Demange. Big Frenchy also had the distinction of being a close business associate of West Side gang lord Owney Madden. In the wee hours of June 16, Demange was at his club Argonaut when he received a phone call from somebody posing as a federal agent demanding a payoff. A rendezvous was arranged, and when Demange's chauffeur-driven sedan was on the way, it was forced to the curb by 2 other cars. Within moments, Big Frenchy was surrounded by 9 men and forced into another car. The bold move paid off for the Coll mob, who, depending on the source, received a ransom ranging from $25,000 to $75,000. Word of the kidnapping spread quickly, and when he was released, Demange shrugged the whole thing off, telling the press, "It was just a little business deal with friends." Although lucrative, this job earned Coll a new formidable enemy. If having Dutch Schultz and the Mafia on your back wasn't enough, the Mick now had to contend with Owney Madden as well. 2 days after the Big Frenchy snatch, Schultz lost an ally in the Mafia, one of their ranking members, when Danny Iamashia became an indirect victim of the feud with Coll. Authorities learned that Schultz was holding a powwow at his Fifth Avenue apartment and sent 2 detectives to stake it out. Using binoculars, a Schultz lookout noticed them. Assuming that they might be Coll gunmen, Schultz, Iamashia, and 2 of the Dutchman's goons went down to confront them. As the gangsters approached, one of the detectives identified himself and drew his pistol. Seeing this, Iamashia went for his own gun and was shot in the stomach. The 2 goons hightailed it into Central Park. Schultz ran up Fifth Avenue, but when a bullet whizzed by his ear, he stopped in his tracks. He was arrested for having a gun and brought in. The Dutchman's attorneys were able to provide a pistol permit for the gun, and Schultz was released. Iamashia succumbed to his wounds and received a grand gangster funeral consisting of 150 cars and ostentatious floral tributes. The demise of Danny Iamashia also resulted in an ancillary casualty of the war. A few hours after learning that her boyfriend was dead, Iamashia's girlfriend Irene Comerford threw herself out of her hotel window. She was rushed to the hospital with a fractured skull and died the following day. Her body was sent back to her native Philadelphia. It has long been suggested that over the summer of 1931, gangster Jack Legs Diamond, who himself was on the outs for numerous reasons, and Vincent Coll joined forces. It would have been a perfect fit. Legs was a boss in search of a gang, and Coll had the gang that could benefit from experienced leadership. In his novel Legs, author William Kennedy suggests that Diamond orchestrated the Big Frenchie kidnapping. It would have been easy for a Diamond-Coll merger. One of Legs' top guys was Dominic Bufano, whose younger brother Louis was with Coll. Flush with cash from the Big Frenchie snatch, Coll got back to killing. His next victim was a Schultz guy named John Saracelli. At 3:45 a.m., June 21st, two men each armed with a .45 rang the gangster's doorbell. Saracelli climbed out of bed and made his way to the front door. He opened it and was greeted by one of the gunmen. "Good morning," he said before each of them fired a shot into Saracelli's chest. The wounded gangster stumbled into his kitchen and had his wife light him a cigarette before calling for an ambulance. He died later at the hospital. Since it was noted in the press that Saracelli received a large floral tribute from Schultz, we can assume that he was still in the Dutchman's employ when gunned down. After the Saracelli killing, the gang retreated to Legs Diamond's Catskills bailiwick of Cairo, New York. They took a farmhouse just out of town and another in the nearby town of Coxsackie. Authorities were tipped off and police raided both houses on July 19. At the house near Cairo they arrested gang members Louis Bufano, Mike Basile, Arthur Palumbo, Phil Gusso, John DeRosa, and John Burnett. The house in Coxsackie turned up Coll's sister and brother-in-law and another Confederate named William King. Prior to July 28, Coll was just another New York gangster to the public. Not hated any more or less than any other hoodlum, but the events of that summer day would make him the most despised mobster of the era and earn him two new nicknames: Mad Dog and the even less flattering Baby Killer. Joe Rayo ran what was known as the Helmar Social Club on 107th Street. A man, said to be Rayo, was loitering on the front stoop while a number of children played nearby. A sedan pulled up to the front of the building and suddenly pistol and shotgun fire were echoing throughout the neighborhood. When the smoke cleared, the gunman and the intended target were gone. In their wake lie 5 seriously wounded children ranging in age from 3 to 14. One of them, 5-year-old Michael Vengali, died a short time later. Though police had an inclination that the Coll gang was behind the shooting, it would be about 2 weeks before Vincent and his gang would be named as the actual shooters. After what became known as the Harlem Baby Massacre, the Coll gang fled back to upstate New York, taking refuge in Averill Park outside Troy. Coll may have been back in New York City at the end of August. Mob turncoat Joe Valachi tells us that Mafia boss of bosses Salvatore Maranzano hired him to kill Charlie Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese, but the contract was nullified when they struck first and had Maranzano killed in his office on September 10. A piece of evidence supports Coll being around at this time, and police may have inadvertently thwarted an attempt on his life. On August 30, they picked up Ernest Saracelli, brother of John Saracelli, who was killed by Coll's gang earlier that summer. He was carrying 2 handguns. "If you'd waited a little longer, you'd have got Irish too," he told the cops, leading them to believe that he was privy to information that Coll was back in town and he was gunning for him. On October 2, Coll's gang returned to the city en masse and reignited the war with Schultz. 2 of his torpedoes, Dominic Tuffy Odierno and Frank Giordano, stopped off at a Schultz beer drop and killed a worker there named Joe Mullen. Unfortunately for the 2 gunmen, 2 utility workers saw the whole thing. Later a bomb went off at another beer drop. These were the final overt actions of the Coll mob. Within 48 hours the majority of the gang was behind bars. The roundup began after a raid on the Averill Park hideout. In addition to Coll's sister and brother-in-law, authorities picked up Agnes de Lucia, who told detectives that her husband Vincent could be found at a garage in Manhattan. They nabbed him and he apparently spilled the beans because detectives next picked up Mike Basile and Patsy Del Greco at their hotel. This in turn led to the capture of Frank Giordano in his room along with 5 pistols. Finally, detectives learned that the object of their nationwide manhunt and his girlfriend Lottie could be found at the Cornish Arms Hotel on West 23rd Street. Also checked in were Tuffy Odierno and his Moll, and Mr. and Mrs. Fats McCarthy. 5 detectives took the room across the hall and waited. After 3 hours, Coll and Odierno stepped into the hallway. In a flash they were surrounded by armed detectives. Assuming they were rival gangsters, Coll and Odierno froze. Once they realized that the gunmen were actually cops, the color returned to Coll's face as both men breathed a sigh of relief. Though happy with the captures, the detectives failed to grab Fats McCarthy, who managed to slip away. With the majority of the mob behind bars, police and prosecutors proudly announced that the gang had been smashed and that Coll and Giordano, who they fingered as the shooters who killed young Michael Vangali, would be going to the chair. While the state prepared for the baby massacre trial, Giordano and Odierno went on trial for the killing of Joseph Mullen and because of the testimony of the utility workers, were found guilty and placed on death row. While this was taking place, Fats McCarthy managed a second escape on October 19 when he shot his way out of a West Side brownstone, killing a detective and seriously wounding another. A few days before Christmas, Coll and Giordano went on trial. Prosecutors were confident that they had an open and shut case. Their ace in the hole was an eyewitness named George Brecht, who they said was on 107th Street at the time of the shooting and got a good look at the gangsters who pulled the triggers. Coll hired famed lawyer Samuel Leibovitz for his defense. Leibovitz was already a legend amongst gangsters, as his clients always beat the rap. It would be no different for Coll. The prosecution brought Brecht to the stand and he told the jury how he had seen both Coll and Giordano gun down the kids that awful day back in July. By the time Leibovitz finished his cross-examination, Brecht admitted that he wasn't even in the vicinity of 107th Street when the shooting took place and that he was only looking for the reward. He also admitted to doing the same thing in St. Louis. The judge had no choice but to acquit. Giordano went back to death row and Coll left the courtroom a free man. His freedom was short-lived, however. He was quickly rearrested for 2 outstanding warrants. He was released on New Year's Eve after posting a $60,000 bond. He had approximately 6 weeks to live. Coll spent that January in and out of police custody. Since the authorities were unable to put him away, his rivals got back at it. On February 1, 1932, gang members Patsy Del Greco, Fiore and Louis Basile and a few other men and women were hiding out in a Bronx apartment. At about 9:30 that night there was a knock at the door. One of them answered it and 5 gangsters burst in and began spraying the room with bullets. Del Greco and Fiore Basile were each hit numerous times and died on the spot. Louis Basile caught his fair share of lead but survived. One of the women made a dash for safety but was struck in the head with a bullet and died. Del Greco and Basile took their rightful spots at St. Raymond's. It appears that there may have been a traitor in the midst, and a week later it was Coll's turn. Once again, he was staying at the Cornish Arms Hotel on West 23rd Street. Around 1 a.m. on February 8, he left the hotel with a Confederate and, crossing the street, entered the London Chemist drug store. His associate took a seat at the soda fountain while the Mick walked the length of the store and entered one of the telephone booths in the rear. Some accounts have it that he was on the phone with Owney Madden, whom he was trying to shake down, and that Madden was keeping him on the line. About 10 minutes later a large sedan pulled up. 2 guys stepped out and took up guard duty outside the front door. A third man entered and strode to the rear of the store. On the way he produced a Thompson machine gun from under his overcoat. "Keep cool," he calmly told the customers. The man who entered with Coll was allowed to leave. Most likely a traitor who turned in his leader for a free pass. Finding the telephone booth containing Coll, the gunman lined himself up, raised his gun and blasted the 23-year-old gangster into eternity. His mission complete, the gunman calmly exited into the waiting sedan. The pharmacy patrons ran to the booth and pulled Coll out, but with over a dozen holes stretching from his abdomen to his forehead, it was obvious nothing could be done for him. His bid for gangster greatness was over. He was reunited with the gang at St. Raymond's. The final nails were pounded into the Coll gang's coffin the following July when both Odierno and Giordano went to the chair for the murder of Joe Mullen. A few weeks later, Fats McCarthy was killed in a shootout with New York City detectives. Mike Basile was arrested at the time and spent the rest of his youth behind bars. If you would like to read more about New York City gangsters during the Prohibition era, please check out these books available through Amazon. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please click like and consider subscribing.